I am the Dr. Márcio Pereira, neurosurgeon and neuroscientist, dedicates his work to studying how the human brain constructs emotions, bonds, and behavioral patterns that we rarely consciously perceive. Today, he wants to talk about something that seems simple at first glance, but which hides one of the deepest conflicts of the human mind: why some people have few friends. At first glance, the answer seems almost automatic. The socially accepted explanation usually emerges quickly, comfortably, and superficially. It is said that some people are too shy, others too demanding. Some supposedly have a difficult temperament. Others simply don't try hard enough to maintain relationships. In everyday conversations, this phenomenon is reduced to personality traits, as if it were a conscious choice or a discrete, almost moral character flaw. But that explanation is weak. And more than that, it's misleading. When we observe human behavior from a neuroscience perspective, we realize that the number of relationships someone maintains is not a direct reflection of willpower, sympathy, or sociability. It is, more often than not, the end result of a long and silent chain of emotional processes, affective memories, defense mechanisms, and unconscious adaptations that began long before adulthood. The brain doesn't seek friendship. The brain seeks security. This is the first misconception that needs to be dismantled. The human nervous system was not shaped to create deep bonds based on idealism, affection, or abstract companionship. It was shaped to avoid pain, rejection, abandonment, and social threat, because throughout evolutionary history, being excluded from the group meant death. What we call friendship today is, from a neurological point of view, a sophisticated construct that depends on something much more basic: the internal feeling of emotional predictability. When the brain doesn't sense that the other person is predictable, safe, or even minimally controllable, it activates self-protection circuits, even if the individual consciously desires to connect. It is at this point that the silent contradiction that accompanies many people throughout their lives is born: the conscious desire for closeness coexisting with a nervous system programmed to maintain distance. Socially, this is often interpreted as coldness, excessive selectivity, or even arrogance. But behind this behavior, what usually exists is a brain that has learned, often in childhood, that bonds require too high an emotional cost. Neurobiology shows that early experiences of rejection, emotional instability, constant criticism, or unpredictable bonds alter how the amygdala and limbic system react to human closeness. The brain begins to associate intimacy not with comfort, but with risk, not with acceptance, but with tension, not with belonging, but with loss of control. And then something curious happens. The person grows, becomes functional, often intelligent, observant, even charismatic in certain contexts. But internally, they develop a pattern of emotional economy. They speak less than they feel. They observe more than they participate. They maintain cordial relationships, but rarely deep ones, not out of genuine disinterest, but because the internal cost of closeness always seems too high. At this point, the brain is no longer reacting to the present. It is responding to an old survival map. Society, however, does not recognize this process. On the contrary, it reinforces the idea that bonds are simple, natural, almost automatic. A narrative is created that whoever wants to gets to, that friendship is a choice, that you just have to open up more. This social pressure pushes the individual into a constant and cruel comparison between what they feel and what they believe they should feel. This is where the suffering begins to deepen, because when individuals realize they have few friends, they rarely understand this as an adaptive neurological mechanism. They interpret it as a personal flaw, a character defect, or an emotional incapacity. And in doing so, they further activate self-protection circuits, reinforcing the isolation they are trying to combat. The paradox is silent, but powerful. The more someone feels guilty about having few connections, the more the brain associates human relationships with emotional danger. And then comes the question that is almost never consciously asked, but which constantly echoes in the back of the mind. If I get really close, what exactly do I have to lose? This almost imperceptible question begins to guide choices, silences, distancing, and even the construction of a person's social identity. And it is from this question that a pattern is formed which, over time, ceases to be merely circumstantial and begins to define who the individual believes themselves to be. But what exactly is the brain trying to protect? And why, for some people, does solitude seem less threatening than human closeness? When we observe someone who maintains few connections throughout their life, the immediate tendency is to assume absence, lack of interest, lack of social skills, lack of empathy. But from a neurobiological point of view, what usually exists is not a lack, it's an excess. Excessive vigilance, excessive emotional memory, excessive anticipation of loss. The human brain learns through emotional repetition, not logic. If in early stages of life the bond with important figures was marked by unpredictability, silent rejection, constant criticism, or conditional affection, the system nervousness leads people to associate proximity with high cost. It doesn't matter if rationally the person understands that not everyone is the same. The brain doesn't operate based on statistics. It operates based on survival. The amygdala, a central structure in threat detection, does not distinguish between physical and emotional danger. For it, rejection, abandonment, humiliation, or indifference activate the same circuits as a concrete threat. The body goes into a state of alert, cortisol rises, attention narrows, and the nervous system begins to seek protective pathways. Over time, this mechanism ceases to be reactive and becomes anticipatory. Even before getting close, the brain is already rehearsing the outcome: distance, frustration, exhaustion, embarrassment. The mind begins to simulate negative scenarios as a way to prepare itself, or more precisely, to avoid feeling again something that was once unbearable. This is how what many mistake for a reserved personality is born. In fact, it's a refined adaptive pattern, a brain that has learned to conserve emotional energy, that calculates invisible risks, that avoids exposure not out of coldness, but out of anticipated exhaustion. There's an important detail here. This process is unconscious. People don't wake up thinking, "I'm going to isolate myself so I don't suffer." They simply feel a slight discomfort when faced with invitations, a vague resistance to opening up, an almost physical need to maintain emotional distance. And to justify this, the mind constructs acceptable narratives. I prefer to be alone. I don't like superficiality. People disappoint. It's better this way. These sentences sound rational, but they are often just conscious translations of a nervous system that has learned to protect itself. Over time, another phenomenon takes hold: habituation to functional solitude. The human brain adapts quickly to repetition. If most of emotional life takes place in silence, introspection, or forced autonomy, the system begins to interpret this state as normal. The absence of deep bonds ceases to be perceived as a loss and begins to be felt as stability. And here arises one of the contradictions that is most difficult to understand. The more a person adapts to solitude, the less tolerant they become of the complexities of relationships. Small conflicts begin to seem too big. Differences of opinion sound like threats. Others' emotional demands seem like invasions. The brain, accustomed to internal control, reacts poorly to the unpredictability of others. This creates a silent cycle. People want connection, but only if it comes without risk, without demands, without frustration, without ambiguity. But real human bonds never work that way. They require emotional negotiation, friction, vulnerability, exactly the elements that the conditioned brain has learned to avoid. At this point, something even more profound happens. The dopaminergic system, responsible for motivation and the pursuit of reward, begins to adjust. Pleasure ceases to be associated with encounters and becomes associated with the relief of separation. Being alone generates calm. Avoiding interactions generates a feeling of control. Canceling appointments brings a strange peace, and the brain registers this as a victory. Gradually, isolation ceases to be a consequence and becomes a choice, not a conscious one, but a neurobiological one. The person feels they are protecting themselves when, in reality, they are reinforcing a circuit that keeps them emotionally distant from the world. What is most unsettling is that outwardly, none of this seems pathological. The person functions, works, thinks, produces, sometimes even excels. But there is a layer of human experience that remains inaccessible, the genuine, imperfect, chaotic, yet profoundly regulating intimacy of the emotional system. And then a question arises that is rarely confronted head-on, because its answer is too uncomfortable. Could the loneliness some people experience not be due to a lack of opportunity, but rather the result of a brain that has learned to survive by avoiding affection? It is from this question that we need to move forward, because it leads us to an even more delicate territory, the point at which fear ceases to be conscious and begins to shape a person's identity. There is a silent, almost imperceptible moment when a protective mechanism ceases to be merely a response to the environment and becomes an integral part of the individual's identity. It is not a dramatic instant. There is no clear rupture. What exists is a slow internal reorganization in which what began as a defense transforms into a personality trait. This is where the issue ceases to be merely behavioral and becomes structural. The human brain constructs the notion of who I am from repeated patterns. What is repeated gains the status of internal truth. If, over the years, a person avoids deep bonds, rationalizes separations, and finds relief in detachment, the nervous system begins to register this as part of its normal functioning, no longer as a choice, but as identity. That's the way I am. I've always been like this. I'm not a person with many friends. These phrases may seem like neutral descriptions, but from a neuropsychological point of view, they function as seals consolidating a pattern. They close off the possibility of questioning. They transform an adaptation into an essence, and that's dangerous because the brain tends to protect what it believes to be the self. From that point on, any attempt at emotional closeness is felt not only as a risk, but as a threat to one's own identity. The other ceases to be merely unpredictable. They become potentially invasive. Someone who can demand change, reveal vulnerabilities, dismantle carefully constructed defenses. The nervous system responds subtly, not with alarm. A slight boredom, an irritation difficult to explain, a social weariness that arises too quickly, a diffuse feeling that it's not worth it. These reactions are not conscious choices. They are signs of a brain that has learned to associate intimacy with loss of control. From a neurobiological point of view, this process involves constant communication between the amygdala, the prefrontal cortex, and the dopaminergic circuits. When the expectation of frustration exceeds the expectation of reward, the brain automatically reduces the impulse to approach. Motivation drops. Interest disappears. Not due to real disinterest, but due to emotional economy. This is how many people gradually become observers of social life instead of participants. They understand the codes, they know how to converse, they can even be pleasant, but they remain in a safe, slightly detached position, like someone watching a movement they don't intend to fully integrate into. There's always a part that stays out, preserved, protected. The paradox is that this protection comes with a silent cost. The human brain is profoundly regulated by emotional contact. Safe interactions reduce cortisol, stabilize mood, modulate threat perception, and help the nervous system maintain balance. When these bonds are scarce, the organism enters a state of forced self-sufficiency, which appears as stability but is, in fact, a chronic state of mild tension. Over time, this can manifest as emotional exhaustion without a clear cause, a feeling of emptiness, difficulty feeling enthusiasm, or a strange impression that life is always happening in the background. It's not sadness, it's not depression, it's something more subtle. It is the absence of emotional resonance. And here arises one of the most profound distortions produced by the human mind. The idea that absolute emotional independence is a sign of maturity. Society values those who doesn't need anyone, someone who is self-sufficient, someone who isn't shaken. But the brain wasn't designed to function in prolonged emotional isolation. It simply adapts, often at the cost of its own sensitivity. This adaptation creates a silent trap. The more a person gets used to not needing something, the less they tolerate needing it. And the less they tolerate needing it, the further they become from the human experience that, paradoxically, could regulate their own anxieties. At this point, withdrawal is no longer just a behavior, it's a way of being. And perhaps the most uncomfortable question begins to form, still without clear words. Is the loneliness I feel really a lack of people? Or is it the result of an identity built to not depend on anyone? This question leads us to the next level of analysis, the level at which the brain begins to confuse protection with freedom, and where society, without realizing it, reinforces this misconception every day. There comes a point when isolation ceases to be merely tolerated and begins to be interpreted as a virtue. It is at this point that the brain, already adapted to emotional distance, finds a powerful ally: the social narrative. We live in a culture that exalts independence as a sign of strength, maturity, and personal growth. Emotional autonomy is often confused with absolute self-sufficiency. The message is subtle but constant. Don't depend on others. Don't get attached. Don't expose yourself. Don't create expectations. Vulnerability is seen as weakness, and the need for connection as neediness. For a brain that has already learned to protect itself from proximity, this message sounds like confirmation. It validates the distancing. It legitimizes the separation. It gives meaning to what, at its core, originated as a defense mechanism. And so a silent reversal occurs. What originally arose as a way to avoid pain is now interpreted as a sign of lucidity. Loneliness ceases to be felt as a consequence and begins to be presented as a conscious choice. The individual begins to define themselves not by what they feel, but by what they avoid feeling. I prefer to be alone. I don't need anyone. Relationships are too much work. These sentences appear clear, but they conceal a crucial detail. The brain that formulates them is no longer evaluating connection neutrally. It is reacting to an accumulated emotional history marked by experiences that have taught, directly or indirectly, that connecting comes at a high cost. The problem is that the human nervous system doesn't differentiate between voluntary isolation and defensive isolation. In both cases, social circuits become understimulated, and when that happens, something silently begins to change in our perception of the world. The absence of deep bonds reduces exposure to everyday emotional micro-adjustments. Small conflicts, reconciliations, and emotional exchanges help the brain calibrate expectations, tolerate frustrations, and maintain emotional flexibility. Without these adjustments, the mind tends to become more rigid, more self-centered, and less tolerant of the unpredictability of others. The individual begins to feel more comfortable in control than in the exchange. And here emerges one of the most sophisticated traps of psychic functioning. The brain begins to confuse control with peace. The predictability of isolation generates a feeling of stability. There are no conflicts, no obvious frustrations, no direct disappointments. But there is also no emotional depth, there is no mirroring. There is no healthy tension that forces the individual to reevaluate themselves, to adjust, to mature emotionally. Over time, this lack of friction creates a curious internal state. The person feels stable but not fully alive. They feel safe but disconnected, functional but empty. And since this condition does not cause acute pain, it is rarely questioned. Society, in fact, reinforces this. It values the self-sufficient, productive, rational, and independent individual. It creates narratives where isolation is synonymous with strength and permanent introspection is a sign of depth. Little is said about the silent cost of this posture when it is not a conscious choice, but the result of a defensive nervous system. What's most unsettling is that the longer this pattern persists, the harder it becomes to reverse it. The brain adapts to the absence of intimacy in the same way it adapts to the absence of sensory stimuli. It reduces expectations, decreases sensitivity, and adjusts its emotional threshold. This is where many people say they don't miss deep friendships, and they sincerely believe it, not because they don't need them, but because their bodies have learned to function without waiting. But what happens when the brain stops waiting? This is where we begin to touch on the most sensitive core of this issue. Because at some point, the absence of bonds ceases to be merely a functional choice. and begins to shape how a person perceives themselves, the world, and the meaning of their own existence. And it is precisely this point that leads us to the next chapter, where we will see how prolonged emotional isolation alters the perception of value, affection, and belonging, often without the individual realizing what they are losing. When isolation ceases to be merely a behavior and becomes a prolonged state, something deeper begins to happen in the workings of the mind. It is not immediate nor dramatic. It is a slow, almost invisible process that alters how the individual perceives themselves and others. The human brain was not designed to self-regulate. It structurally depends on emotional mirroring. From the earliest years of life, we learn who we are from the responses of others, from their gaze, their reaction, their listening, their acceptance, their conflict. It is in this exchange that the nervous system calibrates emotions, recognizes limits, and constructs identity. When this exchange becomes rare or superficial, something begins to be lost. The person continues thinking, working, making decisions, but they begin to have difficulty feeling deeply. Emotions become flatter, less clear. Joy is restrained, sadness is silent, excitement rarely lasts, everything seems slightly dulled. It's not complete apathy. It's a type of prolonged emotional neutrality. From a neuropsychological point of view, this occurs because the brain goes for long periods without receiving external emotional validation, not in the sense of approval, but of recognition. Without this mirroring, the circuits responsible for processing belonging and meaning reduce their activity. Life goes on, but with less subjective intensity. What is most unsettling is that at this stage, the individual often interprets this state as maturity. He believes he has become more rational, less dependent, stronger, and in fact there is an appearance of stability. But beneath that surface lies a gradual reduction in emotional sensitivity, a kind of adaptive anesthesia. The brain does this to avoid frustration. However, by avoiding frustration, he also reduces his ability to experience deep connection, genuine enthusiasm, and a sense of belonging. The person begins to live in a state of emotional self-sufficiency that seems functional, but exacts a silent price: the loss of resonance with the world. It is at this point that many report a feeling that is difficult to name. A subtle emptiness, an impression that something is missing, even though everything seems to be in its place. A feeling of observing one's own life instead of actually inhabiting it. And since this condition does not cause acute pain, it is rarely questioned. The brain, in turn, interprets this emotional stability as adaptive success. Alertness levels remain controlled. The risk of frustration is low. The system, it keeps things predictable. But this predictability comes at a cost, a reduction in emotional vitality. Over time, this even affects how the individual perceives other people. Relationships begin to seem too complex, too demanding, too chaotic. The other person ceases to be a source of discovery and begins to be seen as a potential source of imbalance. Loneliness, then, ceases to be felt as absence and begins to be felt as refuge. This is where the trap closes, because at this stage, the person doesn't miss friends. They only feel a vague sense of disconnection from their own life, and since there's no explicit pain, there's no urgency to change. The brain settles into this economical, silent, functional mode. But something fundamental begins to be lost: the ability to recognize oneself through the other. Without contrast, without exchange, without emotional friction, the sense of identity begins to become rigid. The person starts to define themselves by habits, routines, and fixed beliefs. Emotional plasticity decreases, openness to the new shrinks, and then a question arises that is rarely formulated clearly, but which begins to echo uncomfortably. Did I really choose this way of life, or did I just adapt to it? This question marks the boundary between adaptation and awareness. And it is precisely at this point that we arrive at the final stage of this analysis, the one in which the brain is confronted with an uncomfortable possibility. That loneliness is not merely a consequence of life, but a construct maintained by fear, habit, and a lack of questioning. There is a point, almost imperceptible, where the brain stops merely protecting itself and begins to silently limit the very experience of existence. Not by conscious decision, not by rational choice, but by repetition. It is at this point that loneliness ceases to be circumstantial and begins to structure the way the individual perceives the world. What is most unsettling is that this process is rarely felt as clear suffering. It manifests itself diffusely, a feeling that the days are too similar, that relationships don't deepen, that something essential always seems out of reach. Life continues functionally, but devoid of emotional depth, as if everything were real but slightly distant. From a neurological point of view, what occurs here is an accommodation of the emotional system to a reduced level of relational stimulation. The brain learns to operate with less exchange, less risk, less impact. It becomes efficient and at the same time limited. Emotional plasticity decreases. And when this happens, the individual begins to interpret their own restraint as identity. They no longer question why they avoid relationships. They simply state that that's how it is. They no longer question the detachment. They justify it. They no longer miss what they never fully experience. This is where the mechanism becomes more sophisticated. The brain begins to protect not only against suffering, but against the possibility of desiring something different. Because desiring implies acknowledging a lack, and acknowledging a lack implies admitting that something was lost or never experienced. This is a realization that is too difficult for many psychic systems to tolerate. So the mind constructs a silent narrative, that less is more, that autonomy is superior, that distance is a sign of maturity. This narrative arises not from malice, but from necessity. It allows the individual to move forward without confronting the most uncomfortable question of all. What if I've learned to live without something that was essential to me? The human brain fears this question because it threatens the internal coherence built up over the years. Questioning it would require reviewing choices, defenses, personal histories. It would require admitting that loneliness, in many cases, was not chosen. It was assimilated. And that's why so many people go through life without many friends, without ever feeling that it's a problem, until at some point something goes wrong. A loss, a prolonged silence, an existential crisis, an event that breaks the routine and reveals the emptiness that had been sustained. At these times, the absence of connection ceases to be abstract and becomes concrete, not like acute pain, but like a feeling of helplessness that's hard to name. A belated realization that there's no one with whom to share certain layers of human experience, not for lack of people in the world, but for lack of internal bridges to reach them. And here is the most delicate point of this entire analysis. The brain that has learned to protect itself from pain also protects itself from depth. He avoids risk, but he also avoids encounters. He avoids frustration, but he also avoids intimacy. He avoids loss, but he also avoids belonging, not out of weakness, but out of adaptation. The question then is not why some people have few friends. The real question, the one that is rarely asked, is another. To what extent is the way you live today a conscious choice? And to what extent is it merely the result of a brain that has learned to survive by avoiding feeling too much? This question does not require an immediate answer. She simply remains silent, disturbing, waiting for the moment when the individual is willing to look at her without defenses. And perhaps that's exactly where something new begins. Not an external change, but an internal break with the idea that being alone is the same as being at peace.